Louisa, thank you so much for agreeing to join us this morning for an episode of The Responsible Edge. You and I have certainly connected seasons ago, it seems, now that we're all snuggled up during the autumn period here in the UK. But yeah, thank you so much for agreeing to join us for an episode this morning.
Thank you. It's fun to be here.
And I have to say, even more so, thank you for being so adaptable, having clarified that we were obviously video recording as well as audio recording this morning. And you very correctly pointed out that this is therefore not just a podcast. This is a video. So thank you for being accommodating on that front.
Yeah, a little bit of a surprise, but anyway, it was fine.
Well, I was saying before that I love when you see, I don't know about you, but seeing these backgrounds, these fake backgrounds that people get of the library fake background is the one that I just find really, really difficult to stomach. So as soon as I see a legitimate bookshelf, I just think, we're here in the real world, which is great to see.
Yeah, although I do also think this comes from like the enormous privilege of having space. And for everyone I know who's kind of stuck working from home in their bedrooms, I totally sympathize with curating your own fake library background.
That is a fair comment. That's a fair comment, Louisa. Yes, I must. That is a very fair comment indeed. Well, look, let's crack on. As always, and as mentioned during our kind of preamble, first kind of 20 minutes or so, we want to give our listeners a real kind of insight into all things Louisa Harris. And as I mentioned, we're really keen to kind of really understand your history and the things that have inspired you to ultimately do what you do, some of those obstacles, some of those passion points, those pivots, etc., that have led you to where you are today, Louisa. So I know that you've got a really interesting, multifaceted background. Feel free to start wherever you would like to, but just give our audience a flavour of you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm calling in today from Margate. It's kind of quite wet. I'm really lucky here to have a garden and live, a few minutes from the sea. And I think for me, that proximity to nature, that anchoring and being somewhere a little bit quiet is a huge part of who I am today. But actually, I'm someone who grew up in London, loved the busyness. And, I talk to a lot of people I admire in the sustainability or responsible business space. And, you hear their stories and that connection to nature and thinking about the planet. It's something that was ingrained in them from really, really small. I'm not sure that's actually necessarily true for me. I think it was something that came a little bit later. Like I was reasonably switched on growing up, but it was probably kind of when I was at university. Actually, come to think of it, as a child, and I probably owe my mother an apology for this. My mum ran restaurants, and I would absolutely beg her not to send school forms back printed on the back of old menus in the recycling pile, or she'd always save wrapping paper, the really beautiful kind, of rewrap presents in it, and me and my sisters would just tease her relentlessly for it. So now I can see her as a sustainability pioneer, but I think she was a bit crazy when we were little. So yeah, I'm really sorry, Mum. And we used to, as a family, we'd love nature. We'd go for walks in beautiful places, but I don't think I had that real connection that when I meet and talk to young people who are frankly driving incredible change today, I'm not sure that was something I really grew up with. Mm-hmm. But I went to university at Edinburgh. I went to study maths and philosophy because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but it felt like understanding the world a bit better in terms of numbers and arguments and ideas felt like a good place to start. And while I was there, first of all, Edinburgh was my first experience of a city, but also that was so close to really amazing nature, partly due to a bit of exploring, partly due to the free party scene. I got to explore some really glorious kind of nature spaces that perhaps I hadn't done with friends as much when I was younger. But also my boyfriend, when I was there in my first or second year, was a very engaged climate activist. And so in spending time with him, I went to some of the climate camps and big protests and really, first of all, got to understand climate science a little bit more, also what was going on with business, really empathizing with the brilliant work. These were some of the super media savvy climate activists who were, super gluing themselves to Gordon Brown or flying toy aeroplanes around the Heathrow planning meetings. I also saw the way the police and corporates were engaging the climate activists, which at that time was quite frightening. There wasn't the same dialogue there is perhaps now, and even now it's not brilliant. And so I think for me, there was a real, first of all, opening of my eyes to what was happening in the world, the situation we were in. But also I'd grown up, my mum runs businesses. A lot of our family friends did too. And I think for me, just trying to think, like, is there a different way that I can make change? And not being 100% sure that, when I looked at kind of my activist friends and the brilliant way they were so sure that this was their way to make change, I suppose I hadn't quite found my tribe in that sense yet. And I think as a change maker, kind of finding your tribe is such a big thing. And for me, it took a little while. Is this good? Should we keep going? It kind of
Louisa, no. This is absolutely brilliant. I was always tempted to jump in, but you were in full flight. We'll go on and go on from university, but let me just ask a few things regarding this experience. So, maths and philosophy, like, what sort of, that's a fairly nuance. You described it perfectly in terms of numbers and arguments and critical thinking, but just give us a bit more of a flavor as to kind of how you feel that sort of grounding from an educational perspective, like how that's enabled you to ultimately go on and do what you do. Like, it's a fascinating starting point academically.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm kind of also really happy to say I didn't finish my degree. I was kind of going through a lot of my own mental health kind of demons while I was at university. And actually, it was kind of coming and working in sustainability and coming back home that really, really anchored and saved me, quite frankly. But kind of that doesn't change the fact that I think it was totally the right choice of subject for me. So just studying Latin, ancient Greek, and maths at school was amazing. It helped me to get into philosophy through a really different lens, I suppose. And I find the history of where our words comes from actually informs so much of how we think today. So I really enjoy getting geeky about that. And I don't underestimate how much of a privilege it was to go to a school where we were just encouraged to study what we found interesting and what we were passionate about, rather than worrying too much about what that meant for a job. Because I think if I had worried too much about it, I might not have ended up studying maths and Greek. I think for some people, maths and philosophy can seem at odds with each other, but actually, if you go back in history, so many of our great philosophers were mathematicians or physicists or musicians, because there's so much overlap. And the more difficult maths gets, the more abstract it becomes. And often when you go into certain parts of philosophy, it actually becomes very precise, very logical, very mathematic. So it was a real joy to have that space to go into those subjects. And it's something that I still get to play with today in thinking and conversation. So yeah, I'm glad it was my anchoring.
And Louisa, I love it. You also explained that so beautifully in terms of the relationship between the two subjects, which is really compelling. Let me ask you then. You mentioned finding your tribe, and I think I think so many of us can think back to those early kind of formative years, sort of post high school into university. Like, you're so right. So much of that is about finding our identity, finding our group, finding our tribe, and finding our direction. When was it? You mentioned coming home and starting to work in sustainability. Can you recall the moment when you realized that perhaps climate activism wasn't your route, but that perhaps working in sustainability was? And can you just describe to us kind of how that played out?
Yeah, sure. So there are a few serendipitous loops that got to that moment, which was only really a few years later. So in trying to figure out what on earth do you do with a maths and philosophy degree, or as it turned out, half of one, I did an internship one summer for an accountancy firm, a kind of top 2023 accountancy firm called H.W. Fisher and Company. And at the end of it, I sat down with the partner who said to me, you can absolutely have a training contract when you finish university, but you have to think, is this something you really want to do? It's 3 years of a lot of training, a lot of work. And I decided it probably wasn't what I wanted to do, but I still didn't have an answer to that. And then fast forward a couple of years, I'd just come back home from Edinburgh to London, was in a pretty not a particularly strong place, like feeling quite unsure. I think our world tells us that getting a degree is pretty much the thing you have to do. So not having kind of got to that point was feeling quite frightening, and like I'd let myself and a lot of other people down. And it was then also 2010, the ash cloud, which, you know, now with everything we know about sustainability is a moment in time where the flight's grounded, we had to stop, we had to do things differently, is an extraordinary learning point. And at that time, I'd just come back to London, and the partner I'd worked for, Russell Nathan, had a few serendipitous moments. So one was being stuck in the States.
Mm-hmm.
And the Harvard Business Review was on making green profitable, which he read from cover to cover. And now there was a trip to Walmart, where over the tannoy a voice said, "Hi, ladies and gentlemen, please don't be alarmed. It's 11 a.m. and we are turning the lights off until 5 p.m. as part of our daylight saving and sustainability program." And, you know, Russell realized, oh my God, as accountants, we tell people that light and heat is a fixed cost. But actually, if you start looking at it as a manageable cost through a sustainability lens, this opens up a whole new range of possibilities. And then the other thing that happened was, I suppose, just for him noticing that his clients were losing out in procurement, not based on quality or price, but because they couldn't meet sustainability requirements that were newly entering tenders. And this was 2010, so quite ahead of its time at that point. And anyway, that resulted in him asking me to come back and work for 6 months to build the business case for a sustainability service line.
Okay.
And so training in carbon auditing, so getting to use a bit of that math side again. We hired a director and became a small team building that. And I think what was really interesting, and I'm so grateful for the kind of mentorship around this. So alongside building a carbon auditing service that was, again, quite ahead of its time and was quite difficult to sell in. At that point, we were still fighting with FDs about, is there a business case for sustainability? Or if there is a business case, why would I act on this? It will come out of my CapEx and the successor will get the benefit. Or, you know, it was all the arguments that I like to think we've moved past a bit, but perhaps we haven't. And alongside that, we also started building CSR strategies, which was my first taster of actually running engagement programs and workshops and learning that, you know, you actually have to bring people on the journey and do the hard work and get involved. But the kind of thing that sat alongside that was that at that time, because there was probably only 1 or 2 sustainability people in every organization, there was this incredible number of sustainability events in London, but there still weren't so many that it was actually a real tribe there. So I was really given a remit to go out in the evenings, go to events to represent my company and to meet people doing cool things in sustainability. So I don't know if you remember, but there was the Guardian Sustainable Business shorts series run by Joe Confino. There was what became the crowd, but I think was then Green Mondays. There was this handful of events, and that was when I started meeting the kind of, you know, the sustainability business people who were kind of exactly my kind of weirdos, like hybrid thinkers, super passionate, really pragmatic, smart, and just kind and generous. I think a lot of people, when you talk about networking events and how it fills you with anxiety and how do you start a conversation, that was just never my experience. These were events where people were throwing you out at 10 p.m. And, you know, I really found that for the people who were more senior, had been around doing this for longer, they were interested in the questions I had. They were happy to follow up with a coffee. And, you know, I think that's really shaped the kind of person I want to be in work always, is just to be generous, to be kind, to listen to people and to offer what I have. Like, you know, I can't get it right all the time. There's a lot of great people to talk to. But that was my first kind of, this is my tribe. And I think just the other thing, I know you're kind of jumping in there, is this is big work to kind of go, I believe I can change the world. I want to make a difference against climate change, against social inequality, against these seemingly insurmountable problems. And it takes a lot of your heart as well as your brain and your time. You know, this is our evenings, our weekends. And so working with people who you like and you want to be friends with and you think are smart and great is a real privilege. And I feel so lucky I've found my tribe.
And Louisa, that was so, again, so beautifully introduced. I want to take you back to that decision that you made when you were offered the chance to join the firm and lead on the sustainability initiatives. Back, this is 2010, am I right in thinking? So at that point, you haven't met, the network, if you like, of sustainability professionals in London who are your, as you say, your tribe, your I'm going to use your term, but your fellow weirdos, I think is the word that you described, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it's the word you use. Where was I going?
Weird thinkers, I think, is the
weird
word.
thinkers. Sorry, weird thinkers, not weirdos. Sorry, weird thinkers. What was it? What was it about that opportunity? Like, do you recall when that was proposed to you? Look, we want you to come in and look at this. Did it kind of give you that sense of looking back to kind of the climate activism experience that you'd had at university and thinking, well, that was interesting, but not quite right. Maybe there's an opportunity here to do something that's sort of slightly akin to that, but ultimately doing it in a more, I guess, in a different way, and in terms of the application of your energy. Was that what attracted you to it? Or can you just give us a sense of that decision?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I know there are so many people out there right now who are trying to design their career in sustainability. So I feel it would be unfair to downplay that there was a lot of luck and generosity in that, right? At a moment where I probably had not the greatest confidence in what I could do. Someone who already knew me and I'd worked for and I'd kind of excelled in this internship. So having that opportunity to go back into a space where I had confidence was a big part of it.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing was, yeah, absolutely, having a work application is something that I was passionate about and a problem that I'd seen in the world. And being able to connect that to a way to make a tangible difference was a big thing. So, we're going to talk today about lots of different areas of purpose. And I think, most of all, what it's about is, can you connect your skills to what the world needs today? And I don't think I had that framework for it at the time, but that was definitely what I was being offered there. And I think the other thing is, particularly when you're dealing with mental health challenges, being able to channel your energy into something that is driving a little bit of good in the world is one of the most healing things there is. That can be probably like skewed in different ways where it's not the most healthy thing. But I think for me, it was really good. It gave me a focus. It took me out of myself. It gave me community and a real purpose. And that did help me enormously.
Louisa, I love that, and I love the tie-in between, I guess, your own personal experience and finding. You use the term love. You use the term finding something that you truly love, that you go above and beyond, that becomes, as you say, that third party element of your identity. I think that's such an interesting sort of way of viewing it. I'm wary of time, and we could almost do a show just, I think, exclusively on looking at your background and experience. But just talk us through from there, kind of what happens next, and what are the other kind of key moments throughout the rest of your career up to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So okay, we'll probably have to do a slightly abridged version, won't we? But so I was at HW Fisher for about 2.5 years. I think we were quite pioneering in what we built as a service line, but we were also a small organization. It was quite ahead of its time. Clients weren't really coming to us for the work. So after about 2.5 years there, I moved to Grant Thornton, again, part of a 3-person team building the sustainability practice. So I've been really lucky to get in at the moment where things are getting off the ground, a lot of piloting, a lot of brainstorming, a lot of dreaming about what's possible. So the service line we built there was all around strategy, board engagement, how do you really embed sustainability into an organization, but also a bit of reporting and due diligence. Being an accountancy firm, what our clients really wanted from us was reporting and assurance. So I spent a few years becoming an accidental non-financial assurance expert. Well, I don't know if I'd say expert, but getting really into the nitty gritty of it. And again, I worked for Jane Stevenson, who was brilliant and gave me a huge amount of freedom to get involved in community events, build our profile. One of the exciting things about that moment in time is like a lot of new things were getting off the ground in the UK. So we were involved with launching the B Corp in the UK. We were the headline sponsor for that. We were on the Development Council for the Future Fit Business Benchmark, got involved in the Integrated Reporting Council, the World Benchmarking Alliance. So a lot of these really still forward thinking ways of measuring business performance other than just profit were then really quite nascent. And because, again, Grant Thornton was still a big company, but we weren't as big as some of the other ones where they could second a senior partner or put a huge amount of money, I was lucky enough to be able to be the person who got to be on those working groups. So that was great. Again, we really struggled from, being quite early on in that time. So if you look at a lot of the big consultancy firms, they expanded rapidly and then contracted. So that team stopped existing in the way it did. And at that time, we had a new CEO called Sasha Romanovich, who did some extraordinary work on purpose, very, very forward thinking. And I was lucky enough to be moved into her team, particularly through the public affairs lens. And I've kind of jumped a whole bunch of years here, but at that point, the UK was doing some really interesting work on purpose. And so at that time, we had the mission-led business review going on. We had the UK National Advisory Board for Impact Investing, and I sat on the chapter for Purposeful Business there. We also had the Government Inclusive Economy Unit, which had some really interesting work on purposeful growth. That was housed in DCMS. I also got to be involved with an amazing project that was spearheaded by Bateswell and Unlimited. And we were a number of businesses on the sounding board for that, which was called Purposely, which was a free online tool for embedding purpose into your articles of association. So there was this really exciting multidisciplinary set of things around public affairs, building new frameworks, standards, community, around the intersection of sustainability and purpose. Then I left Grant Thornton after 6 years and started to really, I suppose, alongside this was in doing more around community. One of the things I got involved with was this amazing organization called Six Heads, which was a shared experiment at the intersection of sustainability and experiential learning, run by started by 6 amazing women who just come out of an Imperial Masters. And they became one of my surrogate tribes. We are still incredibly good friends, and we built some really fun workshops, like taking people on walks, taking people on flying trapeze to explore liminal space. But the real thing was starting to realize that, yes, you need data. Yes, you need a business case. But actually, where I observed people making change, and more than that, where I observed I had the best ability to influence how change happened, was something much more heart-centered, intuitive, around immersive experiences, shifting narratives. And that was where you managed to build capacity for bravery and for a change in trajectory. And then you go in with the business case, the data, and all the pragmatic steps. But it was always that order for me. And so when I left Grant Thornton, my focus was, right, I want to build leadership programs for systems change, and started doing that. And then the pandemic hit, which is not a great time to be doing that. Just before that, also got to get involved with setting up things like Business Declares a Climate Emergency, working with Safi and Minnie, setting up her program. So some really exciting different pieces. Then I also, during the pandemic, started teaching for the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership on their Global Business Sustainability Management course, which is just a real joy. I always feel like I learned so much more from my students. And then more recently, I've been at Brandpie for the past 3 years, a purpose and brand management consultancy, as their head of sustainability and systems change. So again, doing some really incredible work where you get to sit down with the leaders of organizations and define what is the purpose, what is the cultural values, and what are the programs that flow out of that. And then I suppose, well, really, this is a new moment, isn't it? So as of last week, I've stepped down from that in a full-time role. So I am now still working with Brandpie closely. So I'm their fractional chief sustainability officer, which means, I spend probably what evens out at a day a week supporting their work. But for me, the next year is really all about a bit of a personal inquiry. And it's great to be here as part of this. It feels like a good exploration of what I'm trying to articulate. But looking at what is my role in activating courageous leadership, collective impact, and systems innovation. So I suppose, I said to you, it could be the scoop from a consultancy perspective. I'm going to call that curiously liminal, because for me, this idea of liminal space is
Mm.
the space between where we were and where we need to be. It's that uncharted territory, and you need to step into that with courage, with curiosity. But if we always jump in with a really clear plan, an idea of where we're going, then we're still acting with our old knowledge and our old beliefs, our old perspectives. So you need that willingness to move forwards. And so, yeah, my purpose at the moment isn't to be really clear on what my plan for the next 12 months is, but it's to get involved in different things and to really look at where I can marry my skills with different projects to actually scale impact. I think when we were talking earlier, there was an IBM study that came out earlier this year, or it could have been the end of last year because time is doing a little bit of a time warp for me at the moment, that said that companies spend 43 times more on reporting than they do on R&D and innovation, which doesn't surprise me, but does depress me. And so I'm really curious on how do you get into the middle bit where you're actually informing innovation, informing service design, informing behavior change. And back to the subject of this conversation, really making sure that purpose is driving behavior and advocacy rather than describing what it is you already do.
Louisa, you're one of these fantastic guests that we have periodically. I have to say that you just sort of start off and you just have a brilliant way of describing and taking our listeners through an amazing journey of your experience. I know that you didn't really get a chance to really show due diligence to the amount of wonderful things that you've been involved in. I know it goes far beyond the kind of 15 minutes or so that we've had there. I do just want to ask you one question. Actually, I want to ask you two questions on you before we move on to the article. The first one is, when you think about this next year and this inquiry that you're going to be going on, like have you already got those kind of areas of inspiration that you're intrigued to explore further? Have you already got your eye on some particular projects, initiatives, etc., that you might be looking to dive into? And can you give us a flavor of what those might be?
Let me think. So I think one of the things that I know about myself is that to constantly be a freelancer and constantly trying to find new work and living between the reality of I've got 3 opportunities on the table. If all of them come off, I can't even deliver them, and I have more money than I possibly need, and I won't have any time at all, and I'll be stressed. And if none of them come off, I'm going to be in a really frightening position. So I think for me, finding a home is really important. So, continuing to work with the Cambridge Institute as a tutor, continuing to work with Brandpie, and having that, again, surrogate teams and places to belong is really important. I'm also a trustee of Hawkwood, the Centre for Future Thinking, which is down in Stroud, and a place I'm really hoping to be able to give some more time to. So Hawkwood's a beautiful, it's a home, a big home that has many bedrooms. It's in a permaculture estate of land and area of beauty, but essentially it's an arts and education space that is a home for change makers. So it nurtures creativity, well-being, transformational leadership, and environmental thinking. So that's one thing I'd like to be more involved with. On a more local level, I'm a non-exec of a communications agency called Correlate, which again is a social enterprise that looks at how comms can drive change. We've also do a lot of work with the local plastics agenda. So that's another thing. I have 2 small social enterprises, one in recycling and one in fashion, that I'm going to be doing some work with, which I'm not sure if I can say the name out loud, so I'm going to err on the side of caution. But one of those is based in Mexico, and I am going to, so I'm doing about 2 or 3 Spanish lessons a week, and then when I'm going to go and work in Mexico for a month and live with one of the team's parents who only speak Spanish, and do a couple of hours of Spanish classes a day. And, there's a few reasons. One, I've never really learned a modern language in all my time doing Latin and ancient Greek. I can't actually speak any languages. But when I was doing my coaching training with the Neuro Leadership Institute, I remember meeting someone who said that her business gave everyone a budget, all their leadership team a budget of, I can't remember what it was, 500 or 1,000 a year, to do classes in something they had no experience in, because being genuinely bad at something you find clunky is the most humbling experience you can have, and actually the best way to walk in the shoes of people when you're asking people to make changes that are frightening and difficult and frustrating. And I'm feeling all of those things. It is frightening, frustrating, and difficult to be this bad at language. And also because I think the development opportunities for sustainability in Spanish-speaking countries is incredible. So if I ever make it to a point where I could hold a conversation in a business context, I would love to be able to do some more of that. Even just little things, when you speak about purpose as a North Star, if you're not in the Northern Hemisphere, you don't have the North Star. So just like little linguistic things like that are really interesting.
Louisa, I think I can speak for all of our listeners and viewers and say that it is amazing to hear of the breadth and the scope of the work that you've done and that you're doing. When I was asking the question of what you were going to get involved in this next year as your point of inquiry, I wasn't expecting you to reel off 10 or so initiatives and projects, etc., that you're involved in. It is astonishing. And I think actually just reflecting myself on the earlier part of our conversation, talking about you finding, and I'm going to just broadly call it the sustainability agenda, and the opportunity that then presented for you to do something that you were genuinely, passionate by and enthused by, and ultimately grew to love, as you alluded to before. Like, wow, how that's played out because of the, if you look at the degree of the things that you've been involved in, it's astonishing. A final question for you though, on you, and I think this will be a really interesting one. When you get to the end of your career and you're looking back on what you've done, what do you want to be able to say about what you did?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I think that is also a big question that is informing this inquiry at the moment. So I think there are two things for me. One is like a little bit of work for myself on myself, which is one of the greatest skills I have is shifting perspectives and being a catalyst for other people's innovation. So, holding experience that help people to understand systems change, to look at innovation, to be a catalyst and a spark. And every now and again, I can struggle to kind of, with the imposter syndrome we all have, and go, oh, that's not me making change, that's other people making change. So I think one thing is probably for me to own a little bit more that actually being someone who is a weird hybrid thinker and also a pragmatic strategist and designer does unlock impact. And kind of just stepping into kind of, how do you not track that, but how can I do that in a way that is really focused on not talking shops, but actually scaling impact? And then I think the other bit for me is, really looking at where we are right now. So I'm someone who does sit in, you have to be an optimist, you have to be hopeful, because if you don't believe change is possible, then why would you get out of bed in the morning? Or why would you not just do a very nihilistic kind of piece of work and enjoy the death rattle? So, I am an optimist. I believe we can do solutions and humans can do extraordinary things, but I also think we can waste a lot of time executing bad ideas. And so I think I really would like to be able to look back and say the interventions that I chose to spend my time and my energy on really made a difference to what needed to change. And I'm not sure I know what that change is, and I'm okay with that, because I think the science tells us really clearly what parameters we are. We know where we are with the Paris Agreement. We know that we're not on track to meet the SDGs by 2030. We know that this decade is the most critical one in humanity we have to change the trajectory of tipping points. But I think the specific application of the alchemy of the right people having momentum, having a solution that gets adoption isn't an exact science. And so you have to be willing to try different things. I've had loads of good ideas that have failed and loads of surprising things that have got off the ground. So you just have to keep trying.
Louisa, I love that. And I think the overarching, we've had 35 minutes on you, which I hope it's okay if we extend a little bit the conversation, because I think
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm happy with that. But I feel like I think you've used this term throughout this half an hour or so. To me, it all comes back with you to courage. You're clearly living your own personal experience, and the way that that's then manifesting in your professional choices and the things that you're doing, with courage and with conviction in being okay with, I guess, the clumsy, the clunky, as you alluded to. It's okay for these things not to be perfectly, polished. We need to try things. We need to experiment. We need to be, courageous in our inquiry, if you like. And I feel like that, to me, manifests in not only what you've just described in terms of how we need to be thinking about addressing these challenges at a macro level, but actually that applies to the way that you've made decisions about what you're doing, and clearly manifests in you taking this year to inquire more personally as well. So I don't know if that might have been me speaking above my jurisdiction there, but that's the overarching sense that I get from you. Let's move on, and let's touch upon, or let's introduce, I think you used the term optimism and hope in that last response, which I think is a really nice segue into discussing the piece that you shared with us. Actually, I should give you credit for it. And it was the piece on the B Lab UK website about the purpose dividend piece of research that was done with Andrew O'Brien and published by Demos. Louisa, would you mind just starting by giving our listeners a sort of an overview appreciation of what's included within that research and write-up?
Yeah, absolutely. So just the reason I chose this, I suppose, is, I feel like the UK in particular, so this is a UK-centric piece of research that came out at the end of last year. We've been on this journey where before Brexit, there was actually quite a lot of interesting work happening in government. We probably weren't calling it purpose then, but around mission-led businesses. So that was really centered on what are the characteristics of mission-led businesses, and are they an engine for growth? With Brexit, pandemic, multiple government changes, there's been less of a room for thinking around that. So I'm really enjoying seeing actually business driving a conversation now, where we have the Better Business Act, we have B Lab UK, we have work going on at the moment with the PAS 808, which is a framework for looking at maturity of purpose. And now there's actually a working group for an ISO that will look at wellbeing and purpose. If you think about the UK alone, I think back in 2016, there were about 20 purpose-driven consultancies. Now there's an explosion of them. It's a really big thing. And but also, as things grow, they perhaps lose their meaning. So something that's meant to be all about meaning can seem less meaningful. So in the UK, I think over 95% of the FTSE 350 now have a purpose statement, but it's unclear, how is that measured? How is that embedded? What does that drive? I also think that a lot of the conversation around purpose does center on the organization. It's a very internal view. So it's, how can we be a better business? How does this drive better goods and services? How does this motivate and deliver meaningful work for our employees? How does that deliver better service to customers? How does that cascade through our supply chain? All of those are so important. But in an economically uncertain world where we're having multiple conflicts, cost of living crisis, in 2024, 49% of the world can vote. So what I love about the purpose dividend is that it actually looks at how a purpose-led economy can drive growth in the UK. And so it looks at the characteristics of a number of purpose-led businesses. I'm not going to reel off their definitions, because I think it's worth it's a really well put together and clear report, but it looks at things such as how will purpose-led businesses lead to higher levels of growth, how will it lead to higher wages for the lowest paid, what will that mean for capital investment, and in particular, what will it lead for R&D and expenditure, and what will we see in SME growth? Actually, just last night, I was at one of the Anthropy events in a group, and we had a breakout session on how to reboot Britain for prosperity. And one of the big things was saying that, we're great for incubating startups up to a point, but then to get any more investment, they end up leaving the UK and going to Europe or Silicon Valley. And so I think for me, the reason I shared this was because in this whole kind of ESG purpose wash backlash kind of narrative, which I think is, got some really deep roots, but also a lot of clickbait sensationalism. But what this report does is it actually takes it out into an ecosystem context of why being a purpose-led business is actually just common sense, but also it's going to boost the economy and all the different ways that will impact society.
Louisa, that was an absolutely, as expected, sensational introduction to the piece. There's not really much else for me to sort of throw in there that I personally pulled out from it. Let me ask you that for me, the big kind of very obvious, perhaps overly obvious question to ask relating to this is why, in your mind, with such an overwhelming case as alluded to within the purpose dividend as to why we should move towards a purpose-driven economy, why hasn't this happened up to this point, and why isn't it happening as quickly as we would hope it to?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a really good question, and I think if I had the perfect answer to that, I don't know, be some UN ambassador for world peace or climate. So I can kind of share the things that I've experienced and observed. I think the main thing is, and this report does look at SMEs a lot, is that businesses are firefighting. So, back to that optimism point, another thing I firmly believe is there are very, very few people in the world who get out of bed in the morning and think, I want to make the world a worse place, right? There is that small subset of sociopaths, psychopaths, whatever, but for the most part, people are trying to do good. And I think even people who are leading some dubious corporate businesses and strategies have probably bought into a certain form of economics, a certain narrative, certain responsibilities and pressures, and have become in their own way the good guy in their narrative. So I think narrative is a big thing here. How do we connect our skills to what the world needs? And I think see those things as integrated, because often there is this idea of, well, we have to get growth at any cost, and then we should do good on the side. So that's one thing that I think is a big challenge. I think from a SME perspective, business leaders are just exhausted and overwhelmed and firefighting. And that was true before Brexit, before pandemic, before this kind of polycrisis world that we live in. So, I think it's important to remember that a lot of the things that are root causes of problems today, things like industrialization, globalization, mass production, plastics, etc., those were once the greatest inventions of their time that changed the world. And so how do we let those things go and let them go well is a really big challenge. And I don't think we're very good at doing that, kind of letting things curve off and make space for the new. But I think the risk agenda of people leading business today is absolutely huge, And so if we keep this narrative of doing purpose, doing sustainability, meeting ambitious targets is something on top of or aside from your business strategy, and people are being completely overwhelmed by the realities of their strategy, then that's really hard. And, quite understandably, for most business leaders, doing good starts with keeping the lights on, paying our people, not making huge cuts. And these things are still being thought of as separate. So I think that's kind of on a personal level a huge thing for me. And then I think the other thing is, and it's funny, I've heard this 3 times recently from people I greatly admire. One, Christiana Figueres, 2, Paul Pullman. I was at his leadership program called Imagine in Oxford a couple of weeks ago. And then just last week, I was co-hosting the Global Good Awards, and Solitaire Townsend was on stage. And the message is so clear that, we have the tech, we have the finance, we have extraordinary innovation at our fingertips. But I think there's a tendency to default to we don't have the right tech or innovation yet. But actually, it's how do we join the dots between those things? And that is a human challenge. So how do we unlock capital? How do we trample over, no, maybe that's completely the wrong language, actually, I'll rewind on that. But how do we become friends and collaborators with our kind of people we thought were actually our competitors? How do we rethink wealth distribution? So, I find it extraordinary the conversations I get caught up in when we talk about a universal basic income. I can't believe that's such a divisive comment, that it's so difficult to imagine a world where everyone has what they need to live with human dignity and a comfortable life, and I think this is a crisis of imagination as well. I do a lot of work around futures and reimagining our future. And I think, there's a reason we have such mature metrics on environment, because we can imagine clean air, biodiversity restored, reduced carbon footprint. But I think when it comes to inequality, or rather equality, equity, diversity, we can think about what the indicators of that might be, but I don't think that we have a real sense of what does that mean for society? What would that look like? How
Mm.
would we get there? What are the structures and mental models that will get us there? Or what would that look like in our lifetime, or in, 3, 4, 5 generations lifetime? So yeah,
Louisa,
from kind of much more philosophical to the really practical, I think this is extraordinarily hard, and I have both kind of unending amounts of sympathy and frustration about where we are today.
I've got sort of questions that I want to ask you at the kind of very macro level, and other things I want to ask you on the very local level. So I want to pick up firstly on that notion of crisis of imagination, which I think is a really, is that your term, or have you picked that from somebody?
Oh gosh, probably not. Like I think
We'll
I
give
don't
that.
know. It's something that I talk about, but I'm sure many other people have too. I definitely don't own it.
Well, I'm gonna give you the credit for it, because I love it. I think it's, and I think you've really hit upon something with that. Certainly in my own experience. Out of interest, we continue to have conversations with people talking about, within the sustainability field, if you like, the juxtaposition, the relationship essentially between reporting and compliance, which, as you alluded to, I think the term you used was 44 times more resource is going into compliance and reporting than the innovation and creativity. Is that causing, or is that aiding the fact that we're approaching things that way from a sustainability agenda perspective? Is that causing a crisis of imagination to become more pronounced? Is that one of the effects?
It's a part of it. So I think, I don't want to downplay the importance of robust and transparent data, and we need to understand our material impacts in a quantifiable way, and how they align to science if we're ever going to make targets to get there. So we need that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's important. However, I think what happens is, because of the regulation and compliance needs, and I read job descriptions. I have a lot of students who are looking for work. I'm always curious as to what companies are putting in them. I should also say, other than my teaching role, I don't think I've ever had a job with a job description, so it's quite an interesting thing there. But, or one we haven't had to kind of make up afterwards. But sorry, where was I going? So the focus is so heavily on meeting that compliance that, I think there's not always that much budget or time to then go, well, what do we do with all of this data? And that's so true in loads of things. I see it when people write reports, or they host a huge conference, or, you launch a new brand and you spend all of your time and money to get to that finishing line. But what you don't do is go, or what often people don't do is go, right, that's only the start. How do we use this? How does this form the innovation? How do we take this further? And then I just think another point is, I've worked with organizations from tiny startups to organizations with 400,000 people, and even companies with very, very advanced and, award-winning and rightly award-winning sustainability strategies probably only have 1 to 5% of their population working on sustainability. And so you create this narrative of, here's the people who do good and orchestrate it, and then there's the rest of the business as usual. And so this is where I think, if you get a purpose that really connects to what the world needs, and use that as a tool to drive advocacy and innovation, and then do the right programs, you've actually got this potential to have a whole organization of people bringing a sustainability lens to finance, to operations, to HR, to talent. And I think that is a little bit scary for organizations to do, to say, right, we're going to give everyone this remit, everyone the time, everyone the training. And then how do you harness that so it doesn't create chaos as well? It's very, well, no, I don't even think it's very easy, but it's one thing to go, we're going to run a process and give everyone a voice. But it's another thing to go, we're not just going to take that, extract it, and have a small team do something somewhere on the side. But actually go, right, we're going to sift through these ideas and let people have the agency to get involved. And maybe just linked to that, I think another problem is, I've worked largely both in-house and and with my clients in B2B organizations. And I think there's something interesting there where people often think of designers as the kind of mythical R&D people who build products or invent tech or you sit up coming up with crazy, amazing ideas. And I think in that, we've probably done a disservice to the fact that we're all designers. So you design your day, your diet, your service lines, your organizational structure. And I think if we equipped people to have the right skills to build in sustainability then. So, there's a piece of research, which I've forgotten the citation for, it's in multiple places, that says, ultimately 80% of sustainability is determined in the upfront design of a product. I think that's probably true in projects. So are you looking right at the beginning at inclusive design? Are you looking right at the beginning at how you bring the right stakeholders to the table? How you look at profit models that are beneficial to different stakeholders? It's very difficult to retrofit that stuff in afterwards once you've got funding, once you set things up. And so I would love it if, people listening to this actually thought, gosh, I am a designer. Whatever I do, you design this podcast. I've designed, well, actually, I think I've just rambled today, but, I am designing my next year. And I'm specifically saying writing. So this is a big thing, writing a 12-month plan and sticking to that based on what I know today is crazy for me to do. So how do we work with emergent strategies? And the number of times people finish terrible ideas because it was in the business plan and they've got to deliver on that objective, rather than saying, actually, we thought this was a good idea. We now know it isn't. Let's celebrate the failure and move on. That doesn't come easy.
Louisa, there's so much, again, I could possibly pick out of that, but I want to ask you the question. I know you were talking there particularly about projects and about products and the importance of considering these elements, if you like, at the beginning, and how difficult it is to retrospectively factor in some of these considerations if you've already begun the process of developing a product or a project. Talking about it at an organizational level, what's been your experience, and what's your best advice, if you like, for an organization that is looking to retrofit purpose into the core of the operation? How does an organization go about doing that effectively?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think purpose is a little bit different because we do evolve and adapt as organizations, and it's a good idea. So I think the first thing is, think about where this project, if you want to call it a project, sits. So is it really bringing together commercial strategy, financial strategy, brand, talent, sustainability, or is it just sitting in one of those silos? So how is it an integrated process? I think co-creation is a huge thing. So making sure you bring in different voices from your organization. So it's not just a few voices deciding something together. I think another thing is make it authentic. So, yes, you want it to be bold, ambitious, courageous, but it has to connect to what your skills are and what the world needs. And so, I think if you create a purpose that doesn't resonate with your people, then it will become kind of at best ignored, and at worst something that's actually creating fractures within the organization. So I think there are two things for me. One is do the hard work in helping in rolling out internally, doing experiential and immersive workshops on how does this connect to your role? How do you have an opportunity to contribute to it? Because you want everyone in the business to know that what they do contributes to accelerating the purpose. And I think if that's not possible, then something's probably not working. And then I think the other thing is, and we touched about this in the purpose dividend earlier, is to think about who your purpose serves. So, like, first of all, I want to be really clear. I'm fine with business being for profit. So it's okay for it to serve your bottom line. It's okay for it to serve your shareholders. You lose your license to operate. But we all know that business can do loads more. So I think we can kind of move on from that argument. But I do think, yes, we need to have incredibly engaged and well looked after people in your business and your supply chain. And you need to be engaging your customers, you need to be designing products. But I'm also really interested in what about the wider ecosystem? How can business be an engine for change? And so this is where advocacy comes in for me. So how can you use your platform and your voice to drive change? So is that campaigning? Is that engaging in government working groups? Is it engaging in ambitious coalitions to drive change? So for example, the Beauty Coalition is really interesting in terms of bringing together all the major players to look at the big challenges around ingredients, around plastics. On a B2B level, you have groups like Perseus Project and Bankers for Net Zero, bringing together all the banks to look at net zero strategies and SME reporting. I think find where you can make a difference. Find the problems that you can't address alone and look at who you need to work with to shift the dial. Because I think if you keep asking yourself, who should our purpose serve? So if we believe in a world where X is possible, what do you need to keep doing to get there? And take that limitless approach in how you do it. And that's what kind of really excites me. And so I don't think it's necessarily about retrofitting. I think it's almost completely the opposite. It's saying, let's look at where we are today. And I think where your point retrofit is really interesting is it's not about creating a purpose for a completely different organization. It's really paying respect to everything you've done so far that gives you the license to operate, but using that as a platform for really focusing on how you drive innovation in your organization, how you drive change.
And Louisa, I'm going to draw a comparison here to the experience that you're ultimately looking to go through yourself over the next year. This sense of inquiry, the sense of understanding and appreciating what the next phase of your career is likely to look like. It sounds to me like organizations could be doing something similar. They could be going on an initial inquiry to look at what are those collaboration opportunities, what are those partnerships, what are those avenues, if you like, that they as an organization can naturally adopt and align with in terms of the purpose that they can then manifest in the next iteration of their business. Is that a fair analogy to draw or comparison to draw between your own journey and that you would suggest organizations go on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting. A good example is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We have 17 goals that 198 of our countries around the world and governments have signed up to deliver on by 2030. So, I think if organizations are sort of stuck feeling, what does the sustainability agenda mean for us? Then you can actually kind of delve into, this is a shared purpose we all have. And so who else is looking to improve innovation and infrastructure? Who is looking to build resilient and sustainable communities? Who is looking at peace and justice and strong institutions? So, it might not be that you have a huge product footprint, but we all are working towards these shared goals. And I think the more you connect your purposes to a sustainable development agenda, then actually you can mobilize around partnerships and collaborations, and how you meaningfully get there.
Louisa, can you believe that we've had, again, it was absolutely brilliant. We've had an hour already. So we're gonna, I know we haven't even, scratched the surface when it comes to really diving into purpose-driven organizations, but I want to leave that there. Want to finish things with the magic wand question. So, Louisa, if we were to hand you a magic wand, I'm going to be fascinated by your response to this, by the way. If we were to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
I think it probably for me would be this point of how do you build, how do you shift your thinking to really harness the collective intelligence you have within your business, because I think humans are endlessly amazing. And so it would be really investing in building capacity within your organization. And by that, I mean nurturing courage and leadership and systems thinking, and how that connects your business's ecosystem and skills to some of the big, complex, wicked problems of today. And then giving people time to get involved in innovation and design, because at Brandpie we did a lot of research into how people felt about D&I or sustainability or purpose strategies, and time again what came back is, yes, people believe in the vision, but they don't believe they have an opportunity to get involved in it in their day-to-day role, or if they do, they're doing it in their lunch times or their evenings, or they feel it's at detriment to them being seen as commercial and gets in the way of promotions. So I think, yeah, build the skills and give people time and agency would be my magic wand wish. That might be a bit greedy, but I'm going to go for it.
I love that. We've not had that one before, and you've used some fantastic terms throughout this show, and I think you crescendo one of your previous responses with the term, we're all designers, and I think that manifests perfectly in what you've just described as a very, very reasonable and sensible suggestion for the magic wand. This magic wand's getting an absolute it's going to be used out before long, but Louisa, thank you so much for joining us today. That was absolutely brilliant. As I said, we've scratched the surface, but yeah, really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us and giving us your time this morning.
Oh, thanks, Charlie. It's been a total delight.